All right, and I'm going to introduce again Dr. Goosey. He is our forage specialist with MSU Extension. I'm very excited to have him as part of this hay webinar series. So take it away, Hayes.
All right, thank you very much. My contact information here is on the screen. Feel free to give me a call on that direct number or email anytime. I'm here to help and here to answer questions. And so by all means, use the resource for sure. Been on the job now about 2 months, not quite 2 months. And so getting caught up and get up to speed on a lot of things. And so appreciate everybody tuning in tonight. So I'm going to cover 2 topics, crop management and then a little bit of pest management. Going to be a little bit of a recap from the first presentation here, just on crop management on our variety selections and some of the things we want to take a look at. There's the variety, alfalfa variety ratings. You can see it's a PDF online. You can look at these and it gives cultivars, gives different information about them, fall dormancy, winter hardiness, things like that. And that's a real good, useful resource when picking out a cultivar to look at. I'm not going to go into that in real detail. We discussed that in depth the last presentation. But keep in mind also on these slides, I put a lot of text on them because I want to be able to come back and look at this without me being here. And so if I just put notes that only made sense to me, it wouldn't make sense to a lot of people when they looked at it on their own. So I may not cover every particular topic on the screen, but if you have questions, be sure to type it in and we can address those if I missed something you wanted to look at. So if that variety selection, really take a look at the fall dormancy ratings. Those are going to dictate a lot of your quality and the yields of the crop. You want varieties that meet or exceed certain seed requirements. You certainly want to look at the yield of those and the class of livestock that you're feeding. As fall dormancy ratings increase, the feed quality will decrease in terms of digestibility and crude protein. Something to pay attention to. Consider the persistence, how long you want that stand in, look at those varieties, and then some other accounts that you may take into some special consideration with that. So for crop management on forage quality, again, you may want to plant more than one variety. So if you have large acreage to harvest, mainly because you can get varieties that mature at different rates or different times. And so you can pick cultivars that are ready a week apart. And so you can start to cut the more early maturing variety first. And by the time you work your way to that other field or other fields that have a different cultivar in it, you can have that later maturing variety or the earlier maturing and later maturing variety. So you're optimizing that tonnage and that quality point. So one of the biggest things you can do is harvesting at that correct maturity. That's typically the largest effect on quality. And typically we recommend something in that 1 to 10 bloom for most cow-calf or ewe-lamb operations. If you plan extensive grazing, you can choose a grazing cultivar. And then again, pick a variety that's developed under grazing conditions. They have the deepest set crowns and more basal leaves. And those traits then allow for less hoof damage and a quicker regrowth. Always be aware of bloat factors with any alfalfa and grazing varieties. They do yield well for hay, so consider one of those if you do an extensive amount of grazing on the field. If you're looking at stand longevity for crop maintenance, keep in mind that alfalfa is a perennial crop and it relies on stored carbohydrates, starches, and sugars, and they store those in the root system, in that root crown, the tap root. And so there's examples of 50-year-old alfalfa stands, but most of it's going to become unprofitable in 6 to 8 years. I recommend last time about 16 cuts. That's kind of that max end of what you can expect if you're getting 2 cuts a year, 3 cuts a year, 2 cuts and then a regrowth, a fall stockpile on that. So keep that in mind. We take a look at the graph here on the right, our carbohydrates, the percent, and then the days of the year. And so right here in April, typically is when we're coming out of dormancy, maybe a little earlier than that. You can see our root reserves are up fairly high. And as that plant starts to grow and it starts to develop biomass above ground, we see those root reserves then drop until mid-May or 1st of May. And that point is when the plants start to actually increase their root reserves. And that's because there's enough biomass above ground that the plant can photosynthesize enough so that it's storing energy in that root. And so then here, depending on where you're at, sometime mid-June to end of June, we're going to have that first cut. And again, our carbohydrates drop again. And they're using those stored carbohydrates again to grow more alfalfa above the ground. And as that plant starts to mature again, we get biomass above the ground, we get more root reserves. We have our second cutting in irrigated alfalfa. Again, we drop that, and here's our stockpile period. We recommend that you don't harvest or graze on that stand from about the 1st of August through that first good hard freeze when that comes, and then give that, because of the bloat factors, you still want to give that time after that freeze. And that builds that root reserves up, and that's the main thing that determines stand longevity, is by having good root reserves for these plants to go into the winter. So something to keep in mind for that longevity, and that's a pretty important part of production. So we'll move in from the management. Let's move into a few insect pests of alfalfa and grass hay. Going to cover a little bit on alfalfa weevil, mostly alfalfa weevil, grasshoppers, nematodes, aphids, some cutworms, and then a particular grass pest called the black grass bug. So the alfalfa weevil is the key pest of alfalfa. If you grow alfalfa, you've got alfalfa weevil. That's not a question. It's typically more of a problem in irrigated than it is in dry land. Dry land, we see what's called a spotted alfalfa aphid more often, but still they are a problem in dry land cutting, and they're typically a pest of that first cut. So here's a picture of the adult top center. They're about 1/4 inch long. They're a weevil, which means they're a beetle, but they have a real downward projecting beak snout on them. That's what classifies them as a weevil, easy to identify. Then they've got kind of a lighter tannish on the sides and a pretty darker brown stripe down the middle of the head and down the back. The adults, they overwinter as adults, and so they break dormancy and mate in the spring. And then that female will chew a small hole in the stems of alfalfa and deposit eggs. This stem has been split to open up the eggs, but there's just a small, pin-sized hole in the stem where they deposit those eggs inside. They'll hatch, and then they develop 4 instars, or their different developmental stages. If you come down here to the bottom right, you can see the first and second instars are much smaller on the left, and the 2 larger, darker or brighter green ones are the 3rd and 4th instars. They have a real prominent white stripe down the back of the 3rd and 4th instars. It's not so prominent on the 1st and 2nd instars. They develop a real silken cocoon, but it's real loose net. They'll drop to off the plant, and they pupate down in the soil or the biomass, plant biomass on the soil, and they pupate into an adult. And this all happens right about first cutting, and then those adults leave the field. Some stay in the field, but they leave the field, and they hibernate or estivate for the rest of the summer. And then come fall, they'll break that estivation, they'll mate, they'll deposit, or they won't mate, but they'll break that dormancy, feed a little bit, and then they overwinter as an adult. So there's only 1 generation per year in Montana. So again, take a look at that picture on the top. They have a real kind of coal black head on them, real bright green body, and a very definite white stripe down the center of the back. Very easy to identify and separate. There may be some other green caterpillar type creatures in your alfalfa, but they will not be the alfalfa weevil. So like I said, they're primarily a damaged first cut, and the adults cause little damage except to very young stands. The adults only feed early in the spring during that mating period. They deposit those eggs, and then those adults die. So it's mainly the larvae that are causing damage. You can see the fields may have a frosted appearance, but that upper right, you can see what the feeding does. They chew out exactly what it is you're trying to harvest for the livestock. And that's you're trying to harvest the inner leaf material that has the cell solubles and sugars in there. And that's exactly what they're eating too. And so when you get a field that has a lot of damage, that center or the bottom photo, you can see the tips look white on them. You can look at a field that has extensive damage, and you can see it looks like it has a frosted appearance on it. That economic threshold is the point where management costs equal the weevil damage, and it's not a static number. So it's going to depend on the cost of the treatment. It's going to depend on the price of the hay. All the factors that go into that will determine whether it's economically feasible to treat that or not. We use two methods to look at the populations. One are sweeps. Use a standard sweep net, 15 to 20 larvae per sweep, or you can use the shake bucket method, which is the one I prefer. That one's easy to do, doesn't require any special equipment. That's 1.5 to 2 larvae per stem. So let's talk a little bit about what those are. So you want to start monitoring the alfalfa when it's about 8 to 10 inches tall. Fields less than 30 acres, you can do about 4 samples, 5 samples for fields 30 to 100 acres, then take about 10 samples in a field for fields over 100 acres. And you don't want to just sample the field edges. A lot of times insects are more concentrated on the field edges, so you may get an overinflated population by only sampling those. So start on a field edge and then space the number of samples you're going to take across that field to the other side. So you're getting lots of interior samples as well. And so what's a sample? For the sweep net, it's going to be 30 sweeps in a location. Use 180-degree motion, which is starting on one hip and then swinging 180 degrees to the other hip. Flip that net and come back and do that 30 times. You can determine the number of larvae per sweep at that location. Just take whatever larvae you captured, divide by 30, and that'll give you the number per sweep. Do that at the number of locations in the field, and you can come up with a relative abundance. The shake bucket method, just use a standard 5-gallon bucket. I like that one because 5-gallon buckets are pretty easy to come by. Most people have them laying around from one thing or another. The white is the best because it's easy to spot the weevil in the bottom. But in each one of the locations, you want to cut 10 stems. Cut them gently. You don't want to cut them because the insect, the larvae hold onto those stems, but if they're too aggressively cut, they will drop off. So cut them fairly gently, one at a time, and then tip them upside down in that bucket and cut 10 stems then at the number of locations. When you get all 10 stems in that bucket, grab the base and shake those 10 stems up against the side of the bucket pretty vigorously. That'll give the weevil larvae will drop off. Then you can add those up and divide by 10, which is the number of stems you got, and you'll get the number of weevil larvae per stem. And again, you're looking at for 1.5 to 2 larvae is typically where that falls out economically. So take a look at in the top center up here. So typical dates where you want to begin monitoring. And this is all based on temperature. So insects are like plants where they develop based on temperature. The warmer it is, the faster they develop. The cooler it is, the slower they develop. And then there's accumulated temperatures are different in different places in the state. So this is just kind of an approximation to look at to give you an idea. Pick one of these towns that's close to you, and you can get an idea of generally when you want to start to look for that. But again, you can use that 8 to 10 inches tall alfalfa too as a monitoring place or a indicator of when to start monitoring. There's a couple YouTube videos down here on the bottom you can watch on the bucket sampling and the sweep net sampling as well. Just a picture is a sweep net sample. So this will be kind of generally what you're looking at if you've got a fair number of weevil larvae. There'll still be a few adults around in there, but mostly you're going to see these very green, white striped larvae if you have a significant level in the fields. So if we're going to manage the weevils, basically we've got 3 things we can do in Montana. We can do preventative, which is some grazing. We can do in-crop, which is an early harvest or insecticides. And we can do for a second cutting, which is an early raking. So we'll talk about each of those. Grazing is preventative, and so, but it needs to be expressed on universal units. We can't really put it on a calendar date. As you saw earlier, that different monitoring dates start at different calendar dates in the state, so do grazing dates. That's just based on local topography, elevation, accumulated heat. And so we use what are called degree days to predict this, and they're very predictable events for the weevil, just as they are for grasses or any plants. And then allows you to implement those times at kind of at an opportune time. It sets up what's called just a universal calendar. So what am I talking about on that? So let's look at the egg hatch. So this is all of alfalfa weevil. If you look at our accumulated degree dates on the left, and we look at just that physiological event on the x-axis. So egg hatch happens at 172 degree days, and it's not exactly at 172. There's a range, maybe 165 to 178 or something of that nature, but it averages out to be 172 degree days that the eggs hatch. And when we look at 30-year historic averages of those dates, we see that that happens at May 24th, typically at Sydney, and it happens at June 8th in Bozeman. So we're looking at over a 2-week difference. Same thing we do at the peak of the second instar, peak of the fourth instar. June 2nd in Sydney, 18 June in Bozeman, 10 and 27 June respectively. So we're looking again at over 2 weeks difference. And so to set up these grazings, we do it on degree days, because each of those physiological events, which are the egg hatch or the first instar, it has its own accumulated heat, as I just showed you. And that accumulated heat is what's called physiological time. So the warmer it is, the faster physiological time happens. The cooler it is, the slower it happens. And we approximate those with what are called degree days. Basic rundown of degree days, it's the accumulated product of temperature and time. So the warmer it is, the more degree days you accumulate, because 1 degree day is 1 day or 1 24-hour period where the temp is above a lower threshold by 1 degree. And for alfalfa weevils, that lower threshold is 9 degrees centigrade. So at 9 degrees and above, they'll start to develop. And the more above 9 degrees it is, the faster they do. At 9 degrees or 8.9 degrees and below, they stop development. So we can predict very, very closely what stage these insects will be in based on accumulated temperatures. And so what the grazing does is essentially disrupts that crop pest synchronization, because plants develop on accumulated heat, insects develop on that same accumulated heat locally. That means the insect shows up at the same time that the crop is ready. So by disrupting that, we can actually disrupt the damage that's caused to the crop. And that's what livestock grazing does in the spring, is disrupts that crop pest synchronization. You can see here inside the fence here is pretty good weevil habitat. That's if a female, when she's looking for a place to deposit eggs, inside this is a good spot. Outside of this is not. There's not much area and space. And even when the grazing is still continuing, when they're depositing eggs, the livestock are consuming those eggs in large quantities in that field. So how does that affect by delaying or grazing that field in the spring? How does that affect the quality? So in one of our validation fields, it was on June 23rd where we took the yield samples, or these are quality samples, end yield. And we see that from the non-grazed compared to the grazed on the same date, we had a difference in crude protein. It was lower crude protein, higher NDF, lower total digestible nutrients, but a higher yield, and then a higher mean stage by weight, which is is the age of the alfalfa. So you'll look at them aged. Alfalfa has certain parts of the plant that develop very predictably. They're put into stages. And so you can age that alfalfa. And so we see that the grazed plots on the same day, June 23rd, were the same or were younger plants. And that's what grazing does, is it keeps that alfalfa immature. But when we let those fields grow for another 5 to 7 days, we didn't see any differences in the age or in the total digestible nutrients, NDF, et cetera. And so in Montana, a lot of times this can, depending on where you are, can be a bit of an advantage. You're pushing that harvest back from mid to late June into maybe that first part of July, where we've got a little drier weather pattern, so there's a little less rained on hay. So that may be something advantage, but it also over yields that field. And especially if you're using a grazing tolerant cultivar, you put about, a third to a half a ton an acre into the animal in the spring, maybe when they're calving or weaning. It might be during a ewe lamb turnout with ewe lambs, but you put that alfalfa and then you're growing the same yield harvested maybe a week later. So you're actually over yielding on that field, a third to a half a ton to the acre. One thing to also, like I mentioned earlier, is pay attention to the bloat. We did this with sheep. Cattle work just fine to do it. Sheep are maybe not quite as susceptible to bloat, but we also started grazing early in the spring. As soon as those crowns, the alfalfa crowns, start to green up a little bit, even a little after, you can turn on, and that kind of limits the amount of alfalfa that each animal gets in to the rumen and helps to reduce that bloat potential. Observe the weather. Cool, wet conditions a lot of times will reduce plant fiber development, and you want plant fibers to decrease the risk of bloat. And that can result in high proteins, high carbohydrates, leafy forage, and that has been linked to bloat. So things to pay attention to on there as you're doing that. A basic kind of economic rundown of what we did. One of the validation fields we looked at was 47 acres. We stocked it at 147 sheep days per acre. So one sheep on 1 acre for 1 day is 140, or is 1 sheep day per acre. But we grazed that for just about a month, a little over a month, 35 days. If we hadn't grazed that in the spring and we'd have chose to feed alfalfa, hay, about 2 pounds of hay per day for a ewe, at 150 a ton, that'd have been about $6,300 in that alfalfa. So that's money we saved there by grazing that field. Alfalfa production, if we'd have chose, if the numbers would have got to economic levels, and again, that's the nice thing about grazing, is it's preventative. And if for some reason it didn't work, you can still have other remedies that you can try to stop that damage associated with those populations. But if we chose to spray that, looking at about $30 an acre on a 47 acre field would have been about $1,410. And the first harvest loss in that field, we averaged about 4 larvae per stem in the ungrazed areas. And so if the entire field had been that 4 larvae per stem, they're going to eat about a third of a ton per acre at 4 larvae per stem. So you're looking at a yield loss at that same $150 a ton, about $2,500 in that 47 acre field that those weevil ate, the weevil larvae ate. So again, grazing can fit in well to the management. Here's some recommendations. I'm not going to get into that. We calculate them online. If this is, I could do an entire seminar on this if people are interested. But here's some general recommendations that we give about that. And the next slide I'm going to get into is, how we calculate the degree days. They're real easy to do. There's online, there's weather stations all across the state, and this particular website is tapped into each one of them. So we can calculate very easily, put together degree days. You can get up, it literally takes 5 minutes in the morning. You're having a cup of coffee, and you're running this grazing program. With 5 minutes in the morning while you're drinking your cup of coffee, you can see where accumulated temperatures are at. So you have an idea when you want to initiate the grazing, and again, when you want to pull those livestock off that field so you're not damaging long-term yields. So if you're interested in that, or if people are, I could do another seminar at some point on that. Or if you're just interested, if there's just a few of you, I'm happy to work with you one-on-one with a little more detail about that. At that point, this is about a third of the way through, so I'll go ahead and stop and open it up, see if there's any questions that we may have right now.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but once again, for those of you who are attending for credits, please just pop your name in there. We can make sure you're still paying attention.
Good. Okay, well, we'll just keep going. By all means, put your questions in there if you've got them. So so we talked about preventative. Now let's talk about in-crop remedies that we've got. Insecticides are an option. Use them if that top 2 to 3 inches of the plant are 50% or more of the plants are injured, so that frosted appearance on top. If you can't harvest immediately, one of the things you can do to stop weevil damage is harvest. And we'll get into that here in just a few slides. If the weather conditions are favorable for larval survivalship, which are cool or damper conditions, then insecticides may be a better choice. If it's hot and dry, harvest with raking is your best option. And then on these things, consult with your local extension agent for custom spray businesses. I can recommend some, I don't have it here, but we could recommend some products to use, but local businesses that do this, or maybe your own place is set up to spray, then that's something that we can work with you on, or you can work with a local custom spray business. One thing to pay attention to is when you're spraying any crop, especially alfalfa, is protect pollinators. They contribute about 24 billion to the U.S. economy. About 15 billion of that's from honeybees. About 9 billion is from our native bees. Those are the ones that are doing a lot of work just because they're out there to do that. So to minimize those losses, really only spray if those alfalfa weevil larvae reach that economic threshold. If the crop has started to bloom, if there's no blooming alfalfa in the field, there's going to be relatively few bees there. They'll just be passing through. So, but if it is starting to bloom, harvest is a better option than spraying, and it does just as good. Make applications early in the morning or late in the evenings. If there is some blooming, just bees are typically active during the hotter parts of the day. Obviously, avoid treating fields, even though the alfalfa may not be blooming, but if you've got a lot of weeds in the field, like dandelion that's blooming, those bees will be attracted into that. Then follow those label concerns. Down at the bottom here is a High Plains IPM guide that rates insecticides based on bee safety. You can click on that. Montana State, we participate in that. It's several states that do. And then over here to the right, below the picture of the bee, is just the main page. So there's lots of information you can look up on there regarding different crops and issues with pollinators and production. So we talked about insecticides, but let's also talk about early harvest. So that can cause some larval mortality, but mainly what it does is it gets the crop cut and it concentrates the larvae in the windrow. And this is where they're susceptible to drying conditions. Like I said, they peak about that first cut. And when you swath and put them in a windrow, like I say, you've got them concentrated. And then we'll talk here in a few slides about raking, which exposes those. So in early harvest, if you're in 10 to 14 days of cutting, if it's hot, dry weather with haze expected to dry quickly, be sure to run your conditioner, in this case on your swather. Those windrows can be raked and rapidly removed. That exposes those larvae to drying conditions. So any of you that have grown alfalfa have probably seen something similar to this striping that's under the windrows. And a lot of people attribute that to shading effect, that the alfalfa below there was shaded by the windrow, and so it wasn't photosynthesizing, and so you have these stripes. That can be true depending on how long it's out there, but this is primarily related to alfalfa weevil larvae that are concentrated in the windrow. And when that windrow is still moist, they'll feed on those plants, but as it dries, they drop to the ground and they feed on the greening alfalfa below the windrow. And that's what causes that striping. And that's pretty damaging then to your second cut. And it's also damaging, it damages the yield of your second cut because those plants don't regrow, but it's also damaging to the stand longevity. We typically go with 8 larvae per square foot beneath the windrow as being economical. So where are the larvae after the cut? So if we take a look at the swath row here, and right at harvest, if we come up here, anywhere from about 60 to 80% of those larvae are concentrated in this windrow, based on some work that we did years ago, that they're concentrated there. But as that windrow starts to dry down, so we're looking at the bottom down here, windrow dry matter, the percent of dry matter, and we come up to the top chart and we follow that down. As that windrow starts to dry down, they disappear from in the windrow. And we can see that they start to disappear, they start to increase under the windrow from the bottom chart, but they also start to migrate back out into the crop between the windrows, and they'll feed on that growing alfalfa between those windrows at that point, after they've really consumed it below the windrow. And that's where we see that striping effect. And so what is to do with that is to rake those swath rows early. Typically, you rake them the day or the day before, or the day of that you're going to bale. But raking those early, well, a few days after, 3 days after that harvest, depending on the weather, will expose those larvae in that swath row to the drying conditions, and it kills a large percentage of them. So you can look at the survivorship of the larvae in this center chart here. When the dry matter is around 20 to 30%, we have 50 to 60% survival. But as we can rake those and expose that, we increase the dry matter in that row, the larval survivalship drops immensely. And when we did that, we got a numeric difference in yield. There wasn't a statistical difference in there, but we did mainly the post-baling on the far right here, the numbers of alfalfa we were larvae were below that economic threshold of 8 per square foot. So when we look at the relative feed value, here we have, so the pre-swath, post-swath, you can see that all of those, that metric is pretty similar between the crops, between just the harvest alone with a late raking or a harvest with an early raking. And the crude proteins are both about the same. So we're harvesting the same, but we expose those larvae so we didn't have those green up issues below those swath rows, that striping problem. Then that second cut is your better portion of that. So maybe at about 2/3 or so way through the presentation. And so if we have any questions at this point, I can go ahead and take them, or we can just keep bludgeoning on to the end of the program.
I don't see any questions. Let's keep going on.
Okay, sounds good. So we'll move into grasshoppers here. They're an infrequent problem in alfalfa. Drought years on rangeland, grasshoppers will often migrate into alfalfa fields, and especially those isolated fields that are in rangeland or the foothills of areas. Those are the most susceptible. Those that are maybe down in a river bottom that has lots of other cropping around it are least susceptible. An alfalfa field that maybe sits on the edge of a creek bottom and borders a native range, they will be most susceptible to this. And then the migrations to the alfalfa fields occur in that mid to late summer as the native range starts to dry down. That alfalfa, especially if you're irrigated, will still be lush and green at that point. Even with the regrowth on a dryland field will be very attractive to them. So, and if you're in an area with a historic grasshopper population, that's something to look at. Way to calculate the thresholds of those is 20 per square yard on the field margins, and then 8 per square yard in the alfalfa field itself. So if you're bordering rangeland, you can look at the numbers in the rangeland bordering that alfalfa field. If you're getting 20 per square yard, that's the economic threshold, and then 8 per square yard in the alfalfa itself. This is one of the Melanopus sanguinipes, it's called, is one of the worst rangeland grasshopper. There's lots of ones out there, but that's definitely the one that's concerned the most. So depending on where you're tuning in from right now in Montana, you can see the 2021, so this coming summer, the forecast of where the most severe grasshopper damage is going to be. So if you're in kind of that north central, south, or central down to southeastern part of the state, that's where the red is where you're going to have the highest. There is some there in that just west of Billings and a little pockets east of Billings, some over here closer to the western part of Gallen County. And then the orange colorings are 8 to 15, and then we've got it drops down to the light greens and then the blues. And so take a look at the county you're in, generally where you're at. You can get an idea of what that forecast may be for grasshoppers this coming year. And as I said, you use that square yard method. And so you can randomly select points several feet away, and then just visualize 1 square yard. So an area that's 3 feet by 3 feet. And you walk towards that and then count the number of grasshoppers that either jump or fly out of that. And do that around the field if you're doing the perimeters at about 10 locations. And if you're in the crop, then or in the alfalfa, again, start on one edge and work your way to the other. This is obviously when the alfalfa is fairly small, fairly short. When you've got waist high alfalfa out there, this method doesn't work too good. So it's obviously early on in that growing in the spring, or on a second cut primarily is where you would look at that. And then repeat that procedure. This one is like 18 times, but it depends on the size of that field. Get a good representation around the borders of the field, and then you can get an average number of that. Something you can do with those is there's a 60-foot vegetation free zone. It's been shown that grasshoppers, when it's about that width, they don't cross that to find other vegetation. Again, that's an option. It also takes a large chunk of the perimeter of your field out of production, so that's a big hit in yield. You can apply insecticidal bait strips. They're pretty low non-target toxicity, with the exception of what are called ground beetles, and they're carabid beetles. They're a seed predator, a weed seed predator, and they also are predators of grasshopper eggs and other aphids and things that may damage the crop. So there's always kind of a trade-off. Anytime you're using an insecticide, it's the trade-off of trying to get a large number of the target insect without damaging or those beneficial populations. Early harvesting can also remove the alfalfa from the field, just like alfalfa weevil. But again, they may migrate to nearby winter wheat or nearby other green crops. But that's the kind of the part that goes with that. You're getting the alfalfa out of the field before it has that damage. Like same with alfalfa weevil, swathing just doesn't kill significant numbers of the grasshoppers or the adults, the nymphs or the adults. And there's not much evidence of grazing. A guy named Jerry Onsager was at the Fort Keogh Research Center. He was here in Bozeman for a lot of years too. Did a lot of work on livestock grazing impact on grasshoppers, and just not much is really capable of being done by the livestock grazing itself. So there's some options for you to think of, take a look at. Move on to parasitic nematodes. So they're a microscopic, unsegmented roundworm, and they live in the soil. There's root, knot, and stem nematodes have been shown to reduce alfalfa yields in California and Idaho. There's not much done. There's some work in Nevada now. There isn't really anything done here yet in Montana. But they're an internal parasite that resides in the roots of the plants. They don't kill the plant, but they act as a real stressor. And when in conjunction with other stressors like heat stress or drought stress, other insect feeding pressure, they can reduce those alfalfa or those yields. The economic thresholds aren't well understood, even in the states where there's been more research on that. But things to look for in the field. So we're always looking at the alfalfa fields, and we're always wondering what, in this right-hand photo, what some of these patches are in the field. Is that a fertility issue? Is that something to do with pocket gophers or great, gophers in the field, voles that are feeding on the roots below the surface? What's going on with that? A lot of times it could be nematodes. And so we look here in the photo on the left, a regular alfalfa plant compared to those that were damaged with nematodes. You can see they've got shortened inner nodes, and they just have a generally stunted growth. And then there's fewer plants within a patch. And that's one of the things about nematodes is weevils will be pretty evenly distributed in high populations, evenly distributed, but whereas nematodes, they seem to be much more patchy. There's a patch here, and you can sample and find them, and then you go 10 feet away and sample again, and you can't find them. And so it may even resemble what are called cutworm damage. We'll talk about cutworms here in just a little bit, but something to pay attention to. So how do you go about determining that? We have to do a plant bioassay. So with that root knot nematode injury, the root exhibits knots or galls which may branch excessively. So look at the bottom photo here, and you can see the little knot here with lots of small root system coming off of that. But don't confuse that with the sites, the nodules, where the rhizobium, beneficial rhizobium bacterium, form the nodules that fix the nitrogen in soils. It's one of the reasons they like to grow legumes is because of that. So if you dig up some plants and you're looking at the roots, those pinkish nodules that are easily rubbed off the plant, that's the good part of the alfalfa. It's ones that look like this that are not. And again, you can send those in for plant analysis and determine if there's substantial amounts of weevil or nematodes in the field on that. Like I say, there's kind of limited work at this point here in Montana, but like I said, you need to send plants to a diagnostic laboratory there's some information on sampling techniques. And again, contact your county agent or someone like myself here at MSU, a specialist at MSU that deals with things like that. And if it's something that you're wanting to look, we can work with you to try to get some of those analyzed, because soil samples don't work. We need plant samples because not all nematodes are invaders. So we need to know about those that are actually invading the plant. And so you have to understand that by digging the root system of the plant itself. Some things to consider. So we now have nematode-free seed. But before that, there was maybe about 17,000 stem nematodes were present in 1 pound of alfalfa seed. And that's how a lot of cases the nematodes were moved around one place to the other, was in the seeds themselves. One thing to look at as you're moving, if you're concerned about that, or if you do diagnostics and you find certain fields that have high nematode populations in them, you want to be careful. Just clean off the sickle bar or the swather header, the tires. You may get some soil up on that as you're harvesting, swathing. You may have dug a little deep. Get some of that soil off of there, and that's going to help to and let that crop, the soil in that field, the chop 2 to 3 inches dry out. That's going to help minimize the spread from one field to the next if you have certain fields that are very high populations. Move on to aphids here. There's lots of aphids in Montana. Really the only aphid at this point that we know that causes significant damage in alfalfa is the top one. It's called the spotted alfalfa aphid. Every now and then, pea aphid and blue aphids are a problem. They're certainly going to be in the field, but they're just not that prominent in Montana. But that's something that we always try to revisit and make sure that these populations haven't become more prevalent. And so if you have aphid damage, you work with me or work with your local extension agent on identifying those. We can identify those. Down at the bottom here is really a good aphid identification booklet that was put together here on campus. And so it really walks you through aphid identification and what you would have in the field. Spotted alfalfa aphid is very easy to distinguish. It's the only one that has these series of black spots on its back. It's kind of a light yellow colored, lemon colored aphid and has rows of black spots on its back. Very distinguishable from any other aphid in Montana. This one injects toxins in the alfalfa when it feeds. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts. They inject into there, into the plant, and inject a toxin, which is to help digest the plant in the leaf itself, and then they draw the liquid back in and feed off of that. This one also secretes a large amount of honeydew, which is, as they feed, they get a lot of plant material, a lot of liquids. And so that passes through their digestive system and passes out the back end. And it's called honeydew, but it's very high in sugars and high in liquids. And so it's very sticky substance. And that's a real good medium for a particular type of fungus, some of the diseases to develop. And so a lot of times with high spotted alfalfa aphid problems comes a disease problem associated with that. Again, the pea aphid and blue aphid have similar damage, but the blue aphid you would think would be bluer, but it's typically just kind of a blue-green. You can distinguish that a little bit. And so anyway, walk through that. If you've got questions, by all means, get a hold of me. But typically, as I said, it's that upper right one here, the spotted alfalfa aphid is really the only economic one. But if we're seeing economic levels of other aphids, that's something I need to know about, something I'd like to come and see, because from what we know, these are typically not pests, major pests of alfalfa. But if that's changing, that's something I'd like to certainly be aware of. The economic thresholds for these, again, you can see the number of aphids per stem with the pea aphid and the blue aphid, 50 and 20 on 0 to 10 inch, and then 100 to 50 on 20-inch stems. I've never seen populations of this in Montana on stems. And so again, we're not worried about them as an economic impact on the crop. But if you're seeing that, if there's areas that are documenting that, I'd like to know that. That's something we need to know about. Spotted alfalfa aphids prefer hotter, drier conditions. So that's why they're more of a problem with dryland alfalfa production. And 1 to 3 of them, because of that toxin they inject, 1 to 3 on a seedling. So if they get going in the spring, if you seed in the spring, and there's enough around 1 to 3 on a seedling can cause the death of that seedling. And 10 to 20 of them on 0 to 10-inch stems, and then 40 on 20-inch stems. And again, just because of their biology, they seem to do better in Montana. One thing to look at when you're choosing a variety is, so inside of this booklet here, when you open up that PDF, this is just the top portion of that. This is the fall dormancy 2, the very first few. We don't really pay too much attention to that right now, but you can see things like bacterial wilt and fusarium and all these different types of diseases have been bred into the varieties, and they'll tell you, so HR is highly resistant, R is resistant, MR is moderately resistant. And so you can look at that. There's also cultivars that have breeding tolerance or growing tolerance for things like spotted alfalfa aphid and that toxin, pea aphid, blue aphid, the stem nematodes, and the northern root knot nematodes, one you'd want to pay attention to on that. So that's something to look for. If you know that you historically have high spotted alfalfa aphids in your dry land, that's something you would want to select a variety on. Moving to cutworms here real quick. They're a serious pest when they get going, but they're very sporadic. There's no real good predictor of their populations on what drives that, but we do have monitoring, and down here in the middle, we monitor them with pheromone traps. So they're very attracted. It traps the males. The males are seeking out the females, and they've made pheromone traps and that emit the scent of a female cutworm, the adult cutworm, the moth. And they fly to that thinking that, and then they get trapped in the sticky substance. And you can determine the number that are relatively in the area based on the amounts that you catch in those traps. So if you're having cutworm damage, significant cutworm damage, and maybe you're into the wheat business, and a lot of times you'll see them in wheat as well. And so that may be something that you wanted to start monitoring too, even if you're growing wheat for forage or wheat for grain. There's 2 types. There's the army cutworm, 1 generation per year. They both, the other pale western has 1 generation per year as well. They lay the eggs just below the soil surface. In the adults do, the adult female does, in August to October, and those hatch in early fall. And they're a small first instar caterpillar. They're active in the late winter and the early spring, and they're very damaging to winter wheat. And if you're growing winter wheat for grain, or a lot of times people nowadays are growing, there's good cultivars. Some of them are MSU cultivars. The Ray winter wheat is a very good a winter wheat is a forage crop. So that's something to pay attention to, but they also can damage alfalfa pretty substantially. This one army cutworm feeds above the ground at night, and then they go below the soil surface during the day. They may be out on very cloudy or rainy days, but they come out from the soil surface and then they actually feed up on the plant. So you'll see the damage, but you won't be able to find the actual larva, the caterpillar there. And so recognize that you can do soil samples, just sampling that first couple inches of soil in random locations, and then sifting that. You can look at the number of caterpillars that are there. But that's just something to pay attention to, that you rarely see the caterpillars of this one unless you're out at night. The larvae bury, the pupate, and the adults emerge in May. They mate, they deposit eggs, and then they actually leave the fields. And these are the ones that migrate up to the Rocky Mountains and are documented as being the grizzly bear food, that they congregate in stumps and beneath rocks. And after that time in the high grounds, in the high country, then they return to crop fields in the later summers. They mate and they deposit eggs. The other one here on the bottom is the pale western cutworm. The biology is very similar. They primarily feed below the soil surface, whereas the army one, they both spend their days below the soil surface. The pale western rarely, if ever, comes above. They feed on the stems below the soil surface, and that's why they call them those cutworms, because they're snipping off and damaging those stems to the point where they die. There's different management practices we can do out there, and then depending on if you're an alfalfa or small grains, gives you a different, infestation level that you'd want to look at for the economic damage. There's damage to field edge typically happen first. You can fall fallow to expose the eggs because they're depositing eggs in those fields. So if you have a crop, you can just expose those eggs. They're going to be below the soil surface if you're fallowing that field. Here's a little more information. The parasitic wasps, there's some of those out there that do some damage. The beetles, like rabid beetles I mentioned. And then birds are also actively preying on these particular larvae too. So here's some information from MSU, just in a Mont guide on particular cutworms, and you can click on and learn a little bit more about. The last insect talk about is called black grass bug. There's two different species or two different genus in Montana. You can see those here. They have different sizes, but they both look the same, just the general size. So they're a dark gray to black insect. And then if you look in the bottom right, they have very bulging eyes on them. The main part of the hemielytra, the wings, are black. They'll have quite often have little speckled white hairs on there, but then they have a white fringe around the sides of those. And you can capture those with a sweep net. The nymphs appear pretty similar, but they're smaller. So what they do is they suck the sap from the grass plants. Their favorites are wheat grasses, wild rye, and then occasionally wheat. And so when we talk about this, we get into winter wheats as forages. This is where we start to see them. Or if you happen to be growing winter wheats for grains, you can see them in there as well. But for mainly the wheat grasses, which a lot of your perennial forages, I know we're dealing with alfalfa and annual forages, but you'll see them a lot of times in improved pastures and in intermediate wheat grasses or pubescent wheatgrass, anything like that they prefer. That when they suck the sap from the plant, they remove the chlorophyll. And so that plant turns white almost immediately at those feeding sites. So if you take a look at this center portion here, you can see these white blotches on these leaves. That's very good indication in how it appears of black grass bug feeding. And that reduces that plant vigor and you get yield loss from those forages. The management, most of that damage occurs in April and May. And so by the time you're seeing this in the fields, a lot of times most of the damage is done. So what you can do is try to prevent that for next year, or if you're concerned about it, if you know some neighbors had some of this, and you may, is to preventatively harvest that field in the fall. So fall grazing is a very good way. In fact, it's really the best way to manage black grass bug, because what they do is in the fall, they deposit eggs either inside or on the undersides of grass leaves. And so the livestock there that are eating that, and a little bit of it gets trampled, they eat those eggs and it destroys them. And then the next year, it's a very, very effective way of managing grass bug. Black grass bug is with grazing in that. And with that, that concludes what I have here for this evening. Below is a link to my forages webpage on MSU. There's lots of good information about everything forages there, annual and perennials, seeding, anything you might want to know. If there's something that isn't there that's missing, send me an email and ask me, and we'll get some of that information put up. And with that, I'll conclude and happily answer any questions if there are any, and if not, we'll finish up for the evening. So thanks everybody for tuning in.
All right, there's no questions right now, but I will ask everybody to put their name in the chat one more time to make sure you were here for the entire webinar for your pesticide points. While we're doing that, I have a question, Hayes. What would you recommend those producers who are in those high forecasted grasshopper areas to do to kind of prepare for the control this year?
Sure. Well, first of all, look at, so for the forages, rangelands, you can work in, there's called RATS programs, and they have baits that can be distributed on rangelands. And so that's something to work in, contact the BLM office or the NRCS office on that. A lot of times they have information on what's available for those kinds of programs. So for prepping up for grasshoppers, I would recommend this to be ready to monitor the fields, monitor the field edges. And if you're seeing those economic levels and you're within about 10 days of when you would want to cut, I would recommend just getting that crop out of the field and baled up and stored. And you're gonna, even though your yield isn't quite where you would want it, by the time the grasshoppers get done with that, you're gonna have more forage put away by harvesting a little early than by waiting for that. And that's kind of the best thing, we can do on that. And then monitor on if you've got regrowth, you can monitor on that, and that could be an opportunity if you were looking at an insecticide. Look at after you cut that field and you start to get regrowth, be out in that field and try to calculate numbers that are in the field during that regrowth. If you're seeing the economic levels, that may be a time where you would want to look at an insecticide application, so you can really give that alfalfa the best chance to get growing for a second cut or for a stockpile.
Awesome, thank you. No questions in the chat. If anybody wants to unmute to ask a question, you are more than welcome to. Oh, we've got one in the chat here. Do you suggest no-low bait for grasshoppers?
I'm going to have to, I don't even for sure know what no-low bait is, to be honest with you. So I can actually can look that up real quick. Maybe can you give me a little information on what that is? And I could give you an estimate, or I could get a little information and send that out to people. But I'm actually not even sure what no-low bait is at this point. So maybe a little more information on that.
And Carol, if you would like to unmute, you sure can. So I don't know if you saw that in the chat, Hayes. She said Nosema locustae.
Let me take a look at that real quick. So let's see what we can get looked up here real quick. No bait. So
so they have beehives on the property and trying to protect them.
Yeah. So it's a brand treated, brand coated product, and then it's coated with the chemical. Let's see. So it's approved for organic production for people that may be in an organic setting. It's not hurtful to dogs, cats, birds, and other pets. And so based on that, it's a brand treatment. It's not going to be damaging to pollinators. They're not going to, in any large numbers, be attracted. They're really not going to be attracted to that at all. So based on what I'm reading here right now, looks like it's a product. They recommend that you can apply it in tall grasses along the weedy ditch banks, yards and gardens. So that could be something that could be put around. I don't have a real rate of application, but that's something that looks like, if it's not overly expensive, maybe able to be used, around the perimeter of a hayfield or something like that. So I can look into that a little bit more, but on the surface, looks like there might be something to that. You bet.
So yeah, Carol said so far that's the only bee-friendly pesticide we can find.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's true. If you're concerned with bees, yeah, you're every other, even the low. If you looked at when I talked about they rank them in terms of friendliness to bees, they're being ranked in terms of the toxicity, and so. But all of the spray products are going to be toxic to some level to the bees. Yeah. Yep, I will. Any suggestions after research would be greatly appreciated. I will look up some information and I'll get that back to Adrian, and we can. Sounds like she knows you, Carol, so we can I'll get you some information and to her, and we'll get that out to you.
I'll probably just send it out to everyone registered in case they're
Sounds good.
curious
Yeah,
what the answer is.
sounds good. Let me put that on my notepad here.
Okay, do we have any other questions coming in? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to stop recording.